The new Scream film continues the legacy of lampooning horror tropes, but it also poses a question mark when it comes to the essence of the franchise. If you look closely at the painting The Scream by Edvard Munch, it is likely that, at some point, you will begin to feel a certain discomfort. The feeling of anguish and despair that the featured figure represents messes with our perception of reality, and the confusion of colors in the classic painting only shows that, at some point in life, we already feel that our world is going to collapse. It's the famous wanting to scream in public to somehow externalize a pain. And it is exactly this total loss of conscious control that Ghostface, the villain behind Panic, manages to provide with the simple lift of a knife, especially in the 6th chapter of the franchise. With the return of the duo Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett bloody wedding at the helm, Scream VI arrives in theaters worldwide with the proposal to present fans with a new look at one of the most important slashers in horror cinema. We have new rules, new victims, and an even more violent and darker Ghostface than the previous ones. These are elements that work very well and promise to continue working if the franchise doesn't get lost within its own metalinguistic universe. New York, new rules. What do you do when you want to overcome a traumatic moment in your life? Some undergo therapy, others decide to modify some physical aspect to have a false sense of control, and many move to another city to start over. This last case is that of the sisters Sam Melissa Barrera and Tara Carpenter Jenna Ortega, who decide to leave Woodsboro behind after the terrible massacre orchestrated by a new Ghostface in Chapter 5 of the saga, which was just titled Panic 2022. Alongside twins Mindy Jasmin Savoy Brown and Chad Mason Gooding, who also survived the tragedy, Sam and Tara now live in New York, the city that never sleeps, the cosmopolitan center of the world, and all the other cliques about Big Apple you've read around. Accompanied by their private and collective traumas, the quartet tries to regain control of the situation, but things change when a new masked serial killer appears to terrorize them again. Scream VI shows a more violent and terrifying Ghostface than the previous ones. The killer is, of course, Ghostface, immortalized in pop culture since he first appeared in the 1996 classic, The Owner or Owners. In the plural of the black cloak that seems to float wherever he goes is certainly one of the most interesting horror characters for precisely transcending himself. Unlike figures like Michael Myers or even Chucky, the ghostly masquerade is bigger than himself because he is always passing the baton to other identities, something that, if you stop to think about it, dialogues with the very concept of a franchise. Just look at Panic VI. With the clear and felt absence of Neve Campbell as Sidney Prescott, who until Scream IV still held the position of great slasher protagonist, the 6th chapter seems to finally accept that there is no escape from the rules of a franchise. The universe created in the 90s will continue to exist beyond Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven. Old acquaintances and new characters will inhabit it, and new Ghostface identities will continue to emerge. But after all, how to keep a franchise alive without surrendering to cheap gimmicks coming directly from excessive nostalgia? A vicious circle in Hollywood these days. Just look at what happened to Star Wars. In the case of Scream, the 6th film is extremely self-conscious when it decides to embrace this fatality, because, in addition to being the most nostalgic film in the saga, it continues to use its meta-language story to try to subvert our expectations. The opening scene of Scream VI is a great example of this, as it plays with pre-established ideas of what we expect from a horror story. Set in New York, the 6th film follows the quartet that survived the Woodsboro massacre in the 2022 film, and in a world full of remakes, reboots, revivals, requels, and so on, not even Ghostface escaped his ray. The 6th chapter of the franchise is certainly the darkest, bloodiest, and most terrifying, and the great merit of it all comes from the killer's new identity, which is even more perverse and insane than the previous ones. Again, the question of nostalgia also ends up spilling over into the construction of the psychopath, and the film, of course, wastes no time in showing you that you know exactly what you're doing. With that's because, this time around, directors Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillett seemed to be more comfortable with what they had in hand, although the 5th film is already great in its own way. With the support of a script full of references and dialogues that do not take themselves seriously, the duo was ambitious enough to create a violent atmosphere, guaranteeing extremely electrifying sequences that managed to make the best of the New York environment and the idea of a new beginning, an aspect so present in the journey of the protagonist sisters. It's the pure juice of what the slasher has to offer, but of course there are caveats. It is a goal until it ceases to be. Recalling the structure of Scream 2, the sixth chapter of the franchise continues the events narrated in the fifth film, which took the opportunity to revitalize the franchise in current times while criticizing obsessive fandoms and the exhaustive and ridiculous talk of the existence of a post-horror. Now, unlike the previous one, Nekoda even chooses to satirize the existence of franchises, as previously mentioned, repeating the trajectory of the saga until then. The problem is to what extent the meta-language that shaped it will be able to sustain the legacy of Nekoda from now on. While still using its self-awareness, Scream VI calls into question the essence of the franchise. Yes, the sixth film is more violent, bloody, and even more inventive when it uses tropes from the genre to drive the narrative. It's just the right amount of fun, and, as much as the resolution is the most predictable of the saga, the drive that takes us to the final reveal is certainly worth the journey. What's the problem then? There are some annoyances that permeate the construction of Scream VI that leave a somewhat bittersweet taste in your mouth after the credits roll on the screen. One of them concerns the essence of the franchise and everything that has been explained here so far. It's clear that the team involved with the new films wants to revitalize what made Scream so interesting in the 90s, a period when the slasher needed a reality check. It is also clear that certain elements that worked before will no longer work today. After all, everything is a product of its time. However, how long will this stand on its own without Panic ending up becoming an empty franchise devoid of any meaning? If it's self-awareness and satire of horror tropes that got us here, the question is whether it's only a matter of time before Panic wears itself out. As much as its universe allows for updates to happen, we no longer have Sidney Prescott. Look at that. The sixth film seems to be just the tip of the iceberg that could cause a tragic shipwreck. Perhaps this is too pessimistic a thought, or even seems to be the case of a fan who feels offended by not seeing the legacy of a story being respected. However, that's not the question, and it never will be, because the big unknown that Scream VI leaves in the air is whether the franchise's great merit, its self-awareness and intelligent satire, will end up turning against itself, especially if we take into account consideration the requirements of the Hollywood market. Knowing that the seventh film in the franchise is practically on the radar is proof of that. And it is this clash between the old and the new that also bothers Panic VI, especially when the journalist Gail Weathers enters the scene. Courteney Cox's character, along with the return of Hayden Panettiere as Kirby Reed from Scream 4, acts as a bridge between the two generations. However, while Hayden's presence is justified and adds a positive point to the nostalgic content that permeates the narrative, that is not what happens with Gail. The female reporter, who's been around since the first Scream, basically works more as a narrative device than anything else. It's even disconcerting to see her regressing in the development that led her throughout the franchise, something that in a way happened to Dewey David Arquette in Scream 5, for example, and I say this as a person who loved the way the fifth film it was conducted. Sisters Sam and Tara Carpenter are the new protagonists of the franchise. Despite this, the presence of Courteney Cox does not leave anything to be desired in an excellent sequence of the sixth chapter involving Ghostface, which places Gail Weathers in the center of the action. It is in these moments that Scream VI shows its true strength, especially when the new quartet of protagonists, Sam, Tara, Mindy and Chad, captures our attention. Sam Carpenter is the final girl of the time, although the sixth film does not try very hard to make the audience sympathize with her motivations. Tara, on the other hand, benefits from a great job by Jenna Ortega, who manages to expose the character's internal conflicts without seeming forced. Mindy and Chad are extremely funny and charismatic, and along with a new batch of characters, they manage to keep us entertained and on our toes the entire time as Ghostface puts his plan into action. In the end, Scream VI is far from being the best film in the franchise, but that doesn't mean it's bad. There are conflicting feelings about how the revitalization of a slasher that values self-awareness so much will continue or not by appropriating its essence to keep the saga started by Sidney Prescott alive. Perhaps this is where the mention of the painting O Greedo fits the most, then. Well, only the future will tell.
And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this. Leave your like to help the channel more and more. A big hug and see you next time.